All right, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Sarah Krajewski, and I'm a curator of contemporary art here at the Portland Art Museum. I'm really looking forward to tonight's program, and I am so grateful to the artists Danielle McCoy, Kareem Blair, and Christine Miller for joining us to reflect on their recent exhibition, Black Power is a Color. This exhibition was up in July at the Blackfish Gallery, and it considered the role of contemporary art and design in revolutionary movements, particularly drawing inspiration from graphic artists in the Black Power movement and making connections across time to the ongoing movement for racial justice and civil rights up to this very present day. I would like to thank the volunteer board of the Contemporary Art Council for sponsoring the conversation tonight. The Contemporary Art Council of the Portland Art Museum is a membership group devoted to supporting programs that expand our understanding of contemporary art in its many forms. Our programs aim to give artists from Portland and across the country a platform to share their work and their ideas. If you're not currently a member of this group and would like to know more, we'll put a chat link we'll put a link in the chat for you to check us out, so you can just link to that information. A bit of housekeeping before we start. If you'd like to pose a question tonight, please type it into the chat box at any time during the presentation. If it's a question directed to one of the artists specifically, please do add their name so we can make sure we know who to address the question to. So we'll be monitoring that as we go along. Now please allow me to introduce the artists. Danielle McCoy is an Antiguan-born artist and graphic designer currently based in Portland. She is particularly interested in examining the routine's role as a foundational constituent of behavior, language, identity, and institutions. It is through that lens she explores race, gender, and culture. Typically, her work takes the form of writing, graphic design, or a combination of both. Kareem Blair is a designer from Brooklyn, New York, based here in Portland. In his work, he seeks to align design with nature by drawing inspiration from Earth's textures, colors, and patterns. He explores consciousness around sustainable and equitable practices and is interested in storytelling through design. Kareem is currently a senior designer at Nike Jordan, where he is part of the sustainability, business, and innovation team and has led collaborations with Off-White, Gore-Tex, and Travis Scott. He has worked with MIT's Media Lab and is a guest professor at Pratt Institute. Christine Miller is a multimedia visual artist and curator based in Portland. Miller's artistic and curatorial practices center on bringing underrepresented Black artists to the front of the Portland art community and beyond. Her work mines the shadow archives of American history and reveals the root of ongoing racial tension in 2020. Tonight's conversation will be moderated by writer Terrence Watson. Now I'd like to throw this over to Terrence for some remarks and questions that will frame the conversation tonight. So thank you everybody again for joining us, and please take it away, Terrence.
Terrence texted and said that his computer was frozen and he's restarting it.
Oh, all right.
So
let some more folks into the from the waiting room. So hold on, let me go there and do that.
We might be in the waiting room.
Yep. I'm learning some things as we go, everybody. So have patience. All right. Terrence, did you join us?
Any luck?
I'm texting him, but we can still start, if anything, and just kind of pick up.
Okay. Well, I know based on our conversation last night, there was a desire to talk just about the framing concept of the exhibition, and then some of the questions that came out of that that will help frame the conversation. So I think Christine, oh, I've got Terrence. Hold on, folks. Terrence.
I'm back.
All right, great. Great to hear your voice. All right, I'm gonna try to share my screen again. All right, let's see. The trick is now I can't see the waiting room, so maybe I'll have to. Terrence, maybe while I figure out this, you do want to set up the framing aspects for the conversation?
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry if I missed the intros already. But I'm Terrence Watson. I'm a writer based out of New York. And I was asked by my friend Christine, who curated and obviously put together my Black Power is a Color, to be the moderator for tonight. So I'll be talking to her as well as Danielle McCoy and Kareem Blair, the three artists who earlier this year in July put together an incredible exhibit. I think where we should start is what inspired the exhibit itself. Christine, do you want to talk to us about like the infographic and what that's kind of paying homage to?
Yeah, sure. So hi everyone, thank you so much for your time. I'm Christine. Really appreciate you coming. So my background is in product, and with product comes branding and all these other things. So one of the most powerful exhibits I was able to see is Soul of a Nation when I went back home to New York. And I made sure to buy the book, and it was just a beautiful resource of all these talented Black artists. So a little bit about the background and how the show came to be. Blackfish wanted to make a statement of what was happening. And rightfully so, they said, hey, this is not our statement to make. We should open it up. And must have gotten that call or first spoke to Kristen, who's the director of Blackfish, maybe like June 6th. And we had to do a turnaround time in like less than 2 weeks. So it was really crazy. But as soon as I saw this graphic and wanting to hone it down to 3 artists, just wanted to model it and pay homage to Charles White, David Hammonds, and Timothy Washington. There was a museum in LA who wanted to start this collective of Black artists to increase their Black audience. So this was one of the first shows that they did. And I think they did see results of increasing Black attendance to the museum. So on the next slide, with the title of the show and even the background of the show, it was between the 2 ideologies of Emory Douglas and Raymond Sanders. So Emory Douglas is the artist for the Black Panther Party. And he talked about how his art was part of the revolution, while the words of the Black Panther Party represented their ideologies, and equally important. And Raymond Sanders was a painter, and he came out with this pamphlet called Black is a Color. And it talked about race being a means to an end when it comes to art, but also the details and the uniqueness of each Black artist needs to be celebrated. So, and thinking about myself and Kareem and Danielle and how detailed we are and how committed we are to putting out just really beautiful branded work, combined the 2 and named the show after both of them. And I know Kareem, I feel like you had some some extra stuff to say about it.
Oh, yeah, how is everyone tonight? I did. One of the things I loved about it when you actually brought us on, both Danielle and I, was well, first of all, I was unaware of that show in 1971. So what it did was it provided me a access point in which I began to do a little research and just learn more about these artists who I were familiar with, but I didn't actually know their starting point. I know them as, well, at least two of the three I know as household names now, but I didn't know them then. So it was just great to see how they started and jump-started their career. But what I loved about it was at the time, it was three Black designers in the art and design space. And I loved just moving forward into 2020, it personally meant a lot to me that in this particular context, we had two Black designers. And I think it just spoke volumes, not only in terms of a woman's voice in this narrative, but also specifically Black women's voice in this narrative. Because I too, as a Black man, learned a lot just hearing your narrative and your story. And obviously when y'all go into your artwork, everyone else will be able to see your perspective in this world, but it was just insightful for me. And I just love that sort of juxtaposition and recontextualization we have from 71 to 2020. So it just made it even more fun to join in.
Christina, I did want you to kind of talk a little bit, and I feel like this is a good segue coming from Kareem, explaining what he felt like he learned out of working with the two of you. But what was your reasoning behind wanting to work with Danielle and Kareem? Like, why them specifically?
Cool. Well, as mentioned, it was like a super quick turnaround time and an incredible opportunity. And when you have opportunities like that, you have to work with people who you trust. And Danielle and Kareem are both two of my friends who not only I trust when they say like, hey, I can do this, hey, I'm going to deliver, knew that was going to be A1. Also just genuinely love their work. I learned so much from both of them, especially not just with perspective, but in a graphic sense. When I was first doing the flyer, they was beating me up about like alignment. And I just really appreciated that transparency and that honesty to make me feel better. Now I go around and I'm like, that's not aligned, that's not aligned. And it was just such a great learning moment. And their lens of just the world today was so aligned. Didn't even mean to use that word a million times, but you know, the way we align when we talk about Blackness and Black issues was really important. So it just became the perfect mix, and here we are.
No, I think that's a great answer. It sounds like it's like a trio of growth right now between the three of you. So question for Kareem and Danielle, you know, when Christine first approached you, just tell me a little bit about like what you thought about the concept, about, you know, working on this together.
Danielle, you mind if I go first?
Go right ahead.
All right, wonderful. For me, I'll be transparent. It was really more out of a relationship that I have with Christine. We both work at Nike, and we actually met years ago just in passing. And there was just a mutual alignment, just terms of not even, it was more serendipitous in how we just began to communicate. And then we both realized we met in the streets, but that we both worked at Nike, and then started to see each other on campus a lot. And it was really about just our experience at Nike and just what we deal with that oftentimes can't be expressed in those meeting rooms and in those design rooms. And the more we communicated with one another, we started to realize we had a lot of synergy. And then beyond that, we ended up realizing we were both from New York. So then it just became this hometown love as well. So when she initially approached me for the show actually had only like a 4 or 5 day turnaround. So under normal circumstances, I personally wouldn't have agreed to do such a show because the failure rate is just too high to try to go from ideating an idea to then executing that idea and then being able to work with a multifaceted team of just curators and directors and production people to coordinate that show in a 4 to 7 day time span. That's just not something you sign up for. But because of just the way I understand how she operates and the commitment she has, it was like, you know what, for a friend, let me join in. But once I committed, it dawned on me that you should make sure that you actually express who you are and your values and just naturally what you have to say. So it was, for me, it matured. It went from a favor to me understanding the gravity of the situation and making sure I committed to it and executed at a level that I could make myself proud.
I already thought the work was amazing when I first got a chance to view it. But to hear that you guys pulled this together in less than a week in a 4 or 5 day turnaround, I'm just like, yeah, I'm just, wow, you know, that's incredible.
It was crazy. And
yeah.
I'm still twitching. But even just to show some love back to Kareem, like how we met and being in sync, like it was funny. Like I would have some of the worst days at work, and I would just always seem to like bump into Kareem or have like some meeting planned. So yeah, it's that synergy is super important, and that is definitely why like I reached out to him and Danielle.
Yeah. And Danielle, would love to hear from you too. Like what were your initial thoughts? And now that I hear that it was less than a week, some concerns maybe?
Yeah. So for me, when Christina approached me, she kind of like immediately gave the caveat that like, I have this project, I have this thing, but the turnaround is crazy. And I was like, what you mean by crazy? And she told me, and I was like, yeah, that's crazy. But fortunately or unfortunately, however you look at it, I work in an environment where tight turnarounds are pretty common. So I've been sort of conditioned to work in those circumstances. And, you know, when Christine came, I was like, I trust her. We've worked together and we vibe from pretty much the moment we met. And so my initial reaction was like, well, I'll do it because Christine is asking me to do it. But I also had a lot of cynicism once I found out a little more as far as the gallery that wanted to host us. I heard the name Blackfish and I was like, should I take this as a sign that maybe I shouldn't do this? And then, of course, I think with everything going on right now, socially and politically, I'm even more skeptical than I typically am about historically white-led spaces now wanting to elevate Black voices in this climate. And so I was very dubious of that because a lot of virtue signaling is certainly happening from many, you know, white institutions under the guise of elevating Black voices. And like I said, with the turnaround, I was just very, very, very dubious about it. But after we spoke with the folks at Blackfish, I felt really good. I felt a lot better. And my cynicisms were quelled once we had a conversation with them. And so I was like, well, I'll do it. And if Kareem, and I had met Kareem through Christine, and I thought if he's on, if Christine is behind us, then I will definitely be a part of it. And then to Kareem's point as well, just understanding, you know, the gravity of taking up space as Black people, as Black women, as Black artists in this moment, it really dawned on me. And so, you know, I resolved that I had to be a part of it. And so that's how my involvement happened.
Well, yeah, thank you guys for unpacking that for us. And again, I can't believe you guys were able to pull this off in less than 5 days. That's incredible. But I think that's also a good segue into actually jumping into the work. And so everyone can see just what was turned around in that amount of time.
Yeah, and so I suppose it's my cue to kick things off, and I'll give a bit of background about myself and about, you know, what sort of led me to creating the specific pieces for this show. And first of all, I want to say thank you to everybody for being on the Zooms, for taking time out to be here with us. in the midst of everything that's going on. I pray peace for everybody's home right now because I know we're in some tumultuous times. And so back to the work. I think it's important to say that for me, the lens through which my work is filtered is one of a Black Caribbean woman who spent the better part of the last decade in the US. And when I first set foot in America as a college student, as an 18-year-old college student, I recognized really, really quickly, almost immediately, in fact, that navigating Blackness in this country looked markedly different, or was going to look markedly different than it did in my native Antigua and Barbuda, which is pretty much a 98% Black country, right? And I was immediately hyper aware of the white gaze, of my Blackness, and to be frank, it was really, really traumatizing. And I think up until this point and continuing, I'm constantly hyper aware of moving through space and time as a Black woman, right? As also a non-American Black woman in America. And particularly when I moved to Portland in 2015, there was even more nuance that came with those realizations, right? Was my first time on the West Coast, first time in Portland, first time coming to Portland was when I was gonna live here and begin a job. And so it was just a crazy culture shock for me. And also thinking of my experiences going to school in Atlanta, Georgia, and spending time on the East Coast, I recognized pretty immediately here in Portland too that racism and racial relations manifest themselves quite differently than they do even on the East Coast, right? And so my work typically explores just my processing, my way of making sense of the nuances of, honestly, identity as it relates to race, particularly in this country. And one of my first experiences or first kind of recognitions of how the flavor of racism works in Portland was feeling gaslit when I went to a restaurant with my sister when she visited. And the thing about the brand of racism in Portland is it's like shrouded in politeness. And so you almost feel insane because you're like, was that racist, or am I just being overly sensitive? And following that experience, I had to do a level again of processing about what went on, how I felt, and because my background is in graphic design, typically when my output manifests, it is very much in a commercial vein. And so when I kind of thought in hindsight about that particular experience that I had at a restaurant with my sister, I kind of realized that, okay, Portland's brand of racism is nice, which is odd to say. But again, that's what inspired these particular pieces. And in my pieces throughout the show, and if you go to the next slide, Sarah, this is just a better view of that artwork. But on the heels of that experience, I really began to think about my experiences with racism, subtle or not, here in Portland. And I should also mention too that I also see things through the lens of somebody with obsessive compulsive disorder, which means that I pay particular attention to the routine and kind of the building blocks of behavior, and in observing whiteness and how white people take up space in Portland, even white children, white teenagers. Again, the unique brand of racism in Portland was made really clear to me. And so that's where these pieces, again, come from. This is an expression of processing all of that. And yeah, so that's these. We can move on through. And again, further processing just the racial landscape here. I, had experiences in the workplace in corporate America, and feeling very much like, one, in the presence of a white gaze, Black people, and in my experience, Black women especially, don't necessarily have the room or not given permission to wholly come to terms with our emotions or to display them in a way that is maybe unfavorable as far as how white people perceive them. And so I, in conceptualizing these pieces, again, was really thinking about how I had to kind of, one, present a certain demeanor, even though in the wake and in the midst of Black death, Black murder, being exhausted in the context of capitalism, it just kind of, I guess, crystallized to me that, again, I'm not allowed in those spaces to fully process. And again, for these pieces, I chose acrylic because I was also thinking about this notion of transparency in the midst of police officers murdering Black people in cold blood. And just again, just trying to make sense of something that should not need to be rationalized because it's absurd and it's cruel and it's evil. And I should also say that for my pieces in Black Power as a color, I group them, intentionally in pairs because so much of what my output is as a result of internal discourse and conversation, and again, making sense within myself. And so putting things in pairs felt really appropriate as far as being honest and authentic to the internal discourse that often happens in my head. And so that's these two pieces here. And then, with these pieces in particular, again, you see another peer. And I think it's interesting to note too that I didn't make these pieces for the show. Like, I think a big part of why we were able to accomplish the show in such a quick turnaround was that the themes that are expressed, and I'll speak for myself, I know my co-collaborators will speak to their work, but we had already, these are themes that we've always dealt with, I think, in various capacities. And with these two pieces in particular, I'd written the word Negro like this in a sketchbook maybe 3 or 4 years ago. And part of that was, considering, I guess, looking back now in the climate of Colin Kaepernick kneeling, and considering my native Antigua, being around Black people in this country, and thinking about how we speak, thinking about also about the names we've been called, how we've been misnomered, and just considering all those things. I was intentional also about naming these AKA Hebrew Israelites 1 and 2, and there's been very hotly contested conversations about that happening in current discourse as well. And so the title certainly came after I conceptualized these pieces. But all it boils down to is, this notion of a rose is still a rose regardless of what you call it. And so Black people's essence is our essence regardless of what we're technically called. And so that's these pieces. And then finally, to round up my pieces, in thinking about, I see my mom jumped in on the conversation. So I want to shout out my mom in Antigua. Yeah, I'm so happy, my family can see my work, because often they have no idea of what their kid is up to on the other side of the US. So I have to shout out my mom. But particularly with these pieces, in thinking about everything I just said, I kept thinking, especially now, about escape, amusement, enjoyment for Black people. Of course, there's a lot of history behind Negroland, and I can speak further about that later if we have time. But again, just kind of pondering what is the perfect escape for Black people, or so-called Black people. What does that look like? What does our utopia look like, especially considering this show and currently living in Portland, Oregon. And the fact that Oregon as a state was considered a white utopia. It was established to be a white utopia. Just thinking about all those things, and thinking as well of in that notion of Black utopia, or Black people kind of living in peace without the pressure of the white gaze. Just thinking about the modes of escape. And that is what really that these pieces, also thinking about, again, this notion of things manifesting for me or coming out for me in a very commercial way. I went to Disneyland for the first time like 2 years ago, and thinking of how this notion of amusement is packaged up and almost cheapened on shirts and memorabilia, all of that. I'm all over the place, as you can clearly tell. And I think for me, I guess the thing I want to say about my work is that really I am not firstly putting out work to make people uncomfortable or anything like that. If that comes out, great. Or if I'm making people think, but this is really a matter of survival for me as far as making sense of the world. And so that sums up my work. I hope that was coherent. And just wanted to also show what these particular graphics look like standalone. These are certainly themes that I'm going to keep exploring. And with that, I pass the baton.
I guess that's me. Do I just jump start it? I wasn't quite sure the format.
Oh, yeah. Prima, I think you could just, jump into the work.
Cool, I'll just take it from here. So I'll give a super brief overview of myself. So in terms of the work that I was presented in Black Power as a Color, this was all new work for me, but the thought process was something that I had been working on probably the last year or so. I'm from Brooklyn, New York, so I basically grew up in obviously we all know New York, so it's a city environment as one can live in. So I didn't grow up with, I guess, for lack of better words, I didn't grow up with trees in grass and lawns, unless of course we go to certain parks where that is, abundant, a certain park, Central Park, Prospect Park. So Portland has been incredibly insightful in terms of just creating a new way in which I communicate. and the thoughts that I'm starting to have over the last 2 years. So I'm doing an incredible amount of hiking, and of course enjoying the sort of biodiversity that is abundant when you go to certain places on the coast and Cannon Beach and certain state parks. And it's opened up my aperture where I'm now studying a lot about mycology, mushrooms, and algae. And so as a designer, this has really been great for me because it's allowed me to put myself in a different frame of mind in which to design. So now instead of designing solely for commercial and capitalistic interests, I've been more solution oriented in my design process, specifically the last 2 years. And that's also taken me down this even more personal path of farming in America and Black farmers. And so all of these sort of thoughts have been really shaping my worldview the last 2 years. So when this opportunity presented itself, I thought that was a perfect platform in which I could discuss, or rather just externalize what was in my head. And I think externalize is the perfect word to segue into this first piece that we're observing, which was called Bounty Under Their Feet. And this particular print was me reproducing an article in the Atlantic magazine that was discussing the land loss of Black farmers in the United States between 1920 and 2020. So here I realized we were 100 years, 1 century from 1920, and in 1920 we had 1 million Black farmers, and in 2020 we have 45,000 Black farmers. So we've lost about 98% of Black farmers in this nation, and a lot of that has been through systemic racism and systematic racism. Two words that sometimes are often misused or misconstrued, but when you look at systematic, we're really looking at a series of steps in a sort of ecosystem that creates this plight. And that is very much, at the time, was very much organized. And what it did was it kept a lot of Black farmers from being able to acquire acres and acquire land, but it also prevented bank loans. And then beyond the inability to secure financing, a farmer was also unable to secure the equipment necessary to actually produce the work. And then lastly, they were also blacklisted from contract labor. So when you blacklist someone from contract labor and prevent them from being a part of the contracts that guarantee that their produce is going to go to XYZ location and distributed across the nation, a farmer is essentially producing produce blindly. So they're either going to overproduce or underproduce, but either way, they won't know until after the crop's harvest. And oftentimes that could basically bankrupt a Black farmer. And this Atlantic piece was basically speaking on that. And what I wanted to do is take that knowledge that I was learning and externalize it. So, I built the layout in a way that was more aesthetically pleasing to my eye. I started to juxtapose the words and the text with different articles I was learning. For instance, that photo in the center happened in 2016. So that photo is actually a Black farmer in front of 2 federal marshals who are evacuating him from his land. He owned 212 acres of land, but unfortunately he was $60,000 in debt to the IRS in taxes. And he had that land for 32 years. So 32 years of his legacy and his life was wiped out for $60,000 that he was unable to finance. And the marshals are there taking him off the land. Lastly, the highlighting is pretty much what I do with everything that I read. I don't have the best vision, unfortunately. So I tend to highlight everything, you know, so anything I'm reading is covered in yellow highlighter, pink, green, blue highlighter. And I just thought visually it was something I wanted to communicate in my art. So it's something I've been expanding on. Yeah, moving along. Again, I take that highlighter and I started to play with words. What I loved about inequality is that rooted inside of inequality is the word equity. And I thought that was just really profound because without equity, there's always going to be an inequality. Resources have to be properly distributed in order for there to actually be a harmony. And one of the things I also wanted to just play on was food inequality, because when you look at present Black communities in the United States, access to proper nutrition is in short supply, but more importantly, when you don't own the land, you consequently don't own what you grow. And if you can't decide what produce you grow, consequently, you aren't able to provide the necessary nutrition that Black bodies need. That's just something I wanted to touch on in a very just immediate way, just very decisive and immediate. We can move to the next one. Expanding on that last one with food inequality was Forage. This one was kind of funny to me because it started off in just a conversation. What I love about Forage is that I've lately been doing that. You know, since I've arrived in Portland, I've been foraging, and I never was foraging when I grew up in Brooklyn. There wasn't many places to forage, but what I love is that here you can forage for flowers, you can forage for mushrooms. But I thought that when I really sat with foraging, I really realized that there is a degree of privilege one would have in order to forage for these things. From my background and my upbringing and my community, foraging in that context would not be something that one would want to do on a Saturday or a Sunday. You know, no one wants to forage for things or resources or food. And so when I looked up forage, it was an immediate definition of a person or animal searching wildly for food or provisions. And I wanted to take that context and place it in a familiar context for many people in this country. The children have been living on the streets foraging for scraps. And I wanted to use that sentence to show how foraging doesn't have the same appeal once we put it in that context, because now one is almost it's more of a hustler mentality, and it loses its sort of a weekend Saturday afternoon vibe. And I just wanted to show that for many people, that is how we look at forage. And I highlighted the word rage. So again, just playing with words and highlighting them and exposing these words inside of words. And then this piece was an installation. So this one came to me probably like a day before we had to hand in the final submissions. So I guess basically day 4 is when this one came to me. And I thought it was a perfect alignment for the show, because I wanted to utilize, I'm really heavy on geometry. So I wanted to utilize the triangle, which is considered the most structurally sound of all shapes. So I thought that that was perfect, because I wanted to also represent the 3 of us, both Danielle and Christine, in this show. And there was sort of a trinity that was happening. And in between that trinity, we were basically building this sort of community garden. That a lot of this is a sort of amalgamation of a lot of the different topics I've been learning over the years. So everything from, you know, land acquisition and land ownership to reparations to Black farming in the Americas, to indigenous populations and techniques in the sustainable ecosystem, and then more importantly, a civil rights, Black woman civil rights activist and food pioneer, so to speak. Her name is Fannie Lou Hamer, and she was actually one of the first to develop what we now know as the CSA. So what we now do in terms of food access from farms and food subscriptions was actually the blueprint she actually piloted. And many people are unaware that a Black woman actually was at the forefront of the development of the CSA and what we know it to be now. And she developed a farm that was pretty successful for about 8 years to 10 years. Eventually it lost financing because it was located in Missouri. But the region was called Sunflower County. So what I wanted to do was pay homage to that county with those sunflowers. And the name of her farm was called the Freedom Farm Co-op. So I created an iconography or a logo for the Freedom Farm Co-op. And what we did was those flowers were new on day one, but over the course of 30 days, we allowed them to just deteriorate and kind of show sort of maybe a hope unfulfilled or a starting point, but more that needs to be built upon. And then lastly is landowner. So this one was super fast. This one probably came to me quick. It was honestly probably done in like 20 minutes. I do graphic design really fast. It was inspired from a couple things. Jay-Z, the rapper, who made the Range Rover very famous in the Black community. This is a UK luxury automobile, but he gave us that exposure to it, and it carries high prestige. And what I wanted to do was almost reposition our value systems, where a lot of times we're fixated on material wealth and assets. And I'm not I get that. I myself am very much into those things, but what I wanted to do was change my scope and thinking and start to look at different things in which I approach in terms of material wealth, and land is the most important. So it was almost like, how do I take land and make that look to the Black community as shiny and desirable as a luxury automobile. So I played on the Range Rover logo. And that kind of surmises my thesis in a Black Power is a Color exhibition.
All right, hey y'all, again, so the numbers grow. So again, thank you so much for coming. It means so much that you came to listen to us. So I'm Christine, and my work focuses on visual narratives of Blackness and Black identity, and thinking about wordplay and just these little forms of racism that I don't feel is talked about enough. It's funny, I didn't add this piece in, but after talking to Terrence, he's like, you have to include this piece, and I'm happy I did, because it's a really nice way to kick it off. So I'm a dark-skinned Black woman, worked in the fashion industry almost my whole life, and just thinking about the amount of white people and even Black people who talk about this color nude, even when buying like a shirt or something from the store. You know, this color nude, and it's beige. And it makes me think just about the basic language of what nude is. And it's like, who created this standard that white skin or beige skin is the standard? And it's funny because a few people who photographed it, they're like, well, this is hard to photograph. Like, you know, it comes up just kind of like one solid shade. And I'm like, great, you know, because that's how I feel every time I get photographed. And talking to Chloe, took this photograph, shout out to Chloe. Sam, I saw you on here too. We was talking about how Kodak didn't create camera settings for darker skin. And it was only until I think Hershey's or somebody wanted to photograph their chocolate that was when they decided to add features to photograph darker hues and the complexity and detail of darker hues instead of one shade. So at first it was going to be a poster that said, stop asking dark-skinned women for nude or something snarky, but then it kept just editing it down, and I love materials, and it turned into this. So yeah, very happy with the outcome. So the Folks Get Brown in the Sunshine is honestly like my favorite piece because I love Roy Ayers and I love this song. So it's juxtaposed with Natanola. I never said it out loud, funny enough. Skin bleaching advertisement, and even going back to the nude and thinking about the summertime and how people are like, hey, don't stay out too long, you know, you might get darker, or I don't want to get darker than I am. And even thinking about skin bleaching products and how prominent it is through multiple countries, Black countries. I remember my hairdresser, who's Jamaican, she was doing my hair and she just casually was like, oh, do you want some skin bleaching cream? And I'm just like, no, I don't. And she's like, well, I use it and X, Y, and Z. So I think meshing those two together, that song, that you do get brown in the sunshine, and also bring in highlight that, that this is definitely a reality. And one of the things that I noticed a lot about those advertisements, and I kind of purposely meshed the two with Roy Ayers, who's a Black man, and this woman who's on this advertisement as a Black woman, is because in those advertisements, it normally talks about, you know, get the man, get the romance, being lighter and clearer skin. And the word clearer and cleaner was always associated with lighter skin. But it was a lot of reference of romance with having lighter complexion skin. And the piece to the right side, I was actually super proud. That's also another one of my favorite pieces, only because the story behind it. It was supposed to first be vinyl, and found out that the vinyl was $700. And I'm like, oh my God, I can't do that. Don't know what to do. And I just started kind of like rattling off what else can I can do in order to have the same look. So the squares represent just Pantones and color swatches, being in the fashion industry. So I wanted it to mimic that. And it's from the book I was able to release called My Black is the Color of the Sun, with my joint show at Fuller Rosen Gallery. And it was all about talking about identity and growing up. And it's kind of small, but it says, there's no grand story, no exact moment in time. But one day I woke up and I became my own preference. Black is beautiful. My black is the color of the sun. And in my next slide, I'll kind of expand more upon it, but yellow is my power color. And being able to disassociate those negative definitions, which I'll talk about later, and make my own definition of what black is, of what powerful is. It's funny, I have a friend, I showed him, I wrote black power in yellow. And I'm like, well, what do you think? And he's like, well, maybe if you add a fist, or maybe if you put some red in it and some black in it and some green in it. And I'm like, it still says black power, regardless if it's in yellow or not. Like what part of the definition makes it feel different because of the color that's chosen? So yeah, and I'm just so excited because it was highlighted in, highlighted in that New York Times article. And I just wanted to put it because it was such a proud moment. And yeah. So this is part of a collection called The Intentional Definitions of Black. So rest in peace to the powerful Toni Morrison. But she has this book called Whiteness and Playing in the Dark, Whiteness and the Literary Imagination. And I started first reading that book in college and couldn't finish it. And I most recently did and had to try again 3 times because it was such a jam-packed book, but it was genuinely one of the most powerful books that I've ever read. And she talks about how Black and the presence of Black people essentially created this identity in America, these polarities, and that America was able to come about and be what it is today because of the presence of Black slaves, which she calls Africanism or African Americanism. And we can go through the slides. So what her book focuses on is that literary narratives, whether it was books and everything like that, played into the part of perpetuating this idea that Blackness was inferior. So she said, America is the land of the free. They're able to establish that because they know what slavery is, because they have the presence of slaves. And thinking about these definitions, white to this day in the dictionary still is associated with Caucasians. And then it also has pure, full of life, or, you know, all these positive aspects towards it. And again, I check almost every day just to like make sure I'm still on point, but it has things like dirty and soil, characterized by the absence of light, which is why I love to use the word yellow to talk about everything Black, reflecting no light again, sad and gloomy, hostile, sullen, distorted, and darkened with anger. And we can go to the next slide. Oh, and also background about the pieces. I hoard vintage ebony magazines. I actually love them. I have too many and I'm always down for more. So all of these images, especially from these magazines that show such Black beauty and I love being Black, and I love it because we're able to still be beautiful and still tell our own stories, even if the rest of the world says something different. So even with these beautiful images still existing from the 70s, in 2020, we still have definitions of the word Black, meaning wicked or heavy and serious. And it really does say connected with invoking supernatural, especially with the devil. So if you look up the word Black in Merriam-Webster dictionary, that's still really relevant. And it's not something that I take lightly at all. Like, I know when people say to me like, well, that's a white lie, or things like that. It's like, well, who, again, back to the nude piece, it's like, who said that was okay to, who said that meant small? Who said that meant that's a pure lie or anything else? So really thinking about how words and things like that play into it. And my final piece, which I really wanted to talk about, oh no, we could go to the next slide. So this is from a book called The Negro, a Beast or the Image of God. And I work in the apparel industry, worked in there for my whole life. And I wanted to put this on a t-shirt to change up the delivery of it. And most people might not look this up on the internet or look this up in a book, but I thought presenting it on a tee would be a different way, especially for people my age or younger to be more involved. My goal is to do a series of 100 with a collection of 3 in each piece. And currently I have a series of 3. My first one was based off of some sort of pamphlet that a white supremacist group in Louisiana passed around that said, notice, help save the white youth of America, don't buy Negro records. The other one is called Nigger Milk, which was from a 1920s advertisement. And this is my 3rd one. And sadly to say, there will be enough content to make 100 or even more than 100. But I've been so, I don't want to use the word excited, but I've been so anxious to use this content because the first time I saw the book from David Pilgrim's book, I was super unsettled, and it was hard to sleep because the cover was just so grotesque. And again, it was a book from Charles Carroll in 1900, and he was deemed as a professor in the US. And it was a book on eugenics that used Christianity as a tool to argue that Black people were inferior to white people. And if you Google the title of the book, you can read it for free on a PDF, but it's so disgusting that I can never get through the first page. So I only got through the cover, and that's what I put on the front, and put the rest of, you know, the stuff on the first cover on the back, which reads, "The Negro, a beast that was created with articulate speech and hands that he might be the service to his master, the white man." So going back to this example of the Black piece and talking about Toni Morrison's presence of what she calls Africanism or African Americanism, and how that created the identity of America. These two polarities of Negro and beast is what is essentially the foundation of this country, and how relevant this blatant identity is to this day. Even thinking of Black Lives Matter, saying that Black Lives Matter is so basic, and we're saying that we're not beasts. And then for people to make that statement and to protest about it and to get counter narratives of Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter isn't just tone deaf, but is purposely inhumane. And you have to have a level of disconnect of humanity to still not understand, and I say understand in air quotes, after a man gets shot in the back 7 times, walking to his car, after a woman sleeping in her bed and her killer is not being held accountable, for someone pulling out a bag of Skittles and being killed, and the list goes on. And even as simple, sorry, like this just always gets to me. But even if we don't want to talk about that, if we want to talk about just day to day of being Black and having to put on a mask or change your tone for the comfort of white people to not see you as a beast, is something that still happens to this day. And this piece reminds me of this commentary that Frederick Douglass gave on what is slavery. And he talked about how slaves were looked at as property, and we were given anything more outside of them pertaining to being property and functioning well as property. And that's what these Black Lives Matter counter narratives are. It's like you are a beast, and the treatment that you get is because you're a beast. And any protest you do goes against those parameters of the narratives of you being a beast. And you protesting that is un-American. And essentially it is, because that's the foundation of the country, and that is what we're trying to change. And even like going back to Danielle's point and not being here and living in Portland, like the racism is like on a different level. And hearing friends who are in the activist scene talk about how they go to protests and how right-wing supremacists are being protected by the police. That's one thing, but to see it with my own 2 eyes was absolutely mind-blowing. I actually went to that Trump rally with the 600 caravans because I was tired of adjusting my life just to avoid this discomfort. And I'm like, you know what, I'm done. Like, I'm going down there. And I went with somebody, and I saw these humongous white men just pull out guns so casually, and shooting paint guns in the back of cars and beer macing people. And they felt safe. They felt like gods who were completely indoctrinated and protected by the system with no repercussion for their actions, because again, they're gods. And on the flip side, I'm someone who's 5'4", and I don't take out my wallet too fast. And to see these nonviolent protesters get trampled or tear gassed is ridiculous. And even thinking of James Baldwin in The Fire the Next Time, when he wrote a letter to his nephew, and he talks about how Black people have to have a level of grace for white people. And to imagine how it felt to be white and to hold on to a history that Black men were inferior to white people, and that any other ideology is like the sun rising while all of the stars ablaze. And that's essentially all that Make America Great is again. A bunch of cowards trying to restore that history and false universe which is essentially rooted in insecurity and whiteness being the sole source of their power. But again, for the sake of time, because I could go on for this forever, but what I want everyone on this call, especially if you're not Black, to get out of the show and all of our work is that besides changing narratives of Blackness, is that you're equally committed to retaining Black people living and breathing on this earth as much, and if not more, than you're committed to retaining our talents and culture. Because the one thing I genuinely want to do more than creating is to be alive. And I was going to say that that's a threat every time I leave my house, but in thinking of the late and recent death of Breonna Taylor in her own home, us being alive is just a threat every day we exist. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Well, Christine, you really delivered on something there, like that last word, man. I think we all think a little bit more about like Brianna and the idea of even your home not being safe. Man. Well, thank you to the three of you. I just started thinking about like, this is my second time seeing the exhibit and just hearing more about what you guys think. And I started thinking about the idea of Black power, and then like what three words I could use to surmise like how you guys like have a synergy. And I started thinking of like freedom, wealth, and self-identity. To me, come from like what the works that you guys have presented to kind of like expand on what Black power is. So thank you again. Real quick, I would love to get into a couple pieces with you guys, just some of my favorites, just to talk about real quick. And I'll start with Danielle, because you went first. We can go to your piece, business as usual. And again, I'm just picking the pieces that kind of just resonated with me the most, and I think we spoke about this. Once I saw Black grief has no place during business hours, it just hit home. I myself work in the creative industry, and I've had to just kind of compartmentalize, like, another Black death or lynching that's publicized, and it happens. And because I'm like one of the few Black people in whatever space I'm in, usually if I'm working in an office, and no one else really reacts, right? And those deliverables better be there by 4:00. You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, this really resonated again with me, because like I've also completely experienced this. And I think we also spoke about the recent article by Shaniqua Golding that's kind of gone viral. I think Jeff Bezos, he was big in like reading it and also putting it out there. But it basically talked about what this is talking about, where I believe the name of it was looking for the name. Sorry, Professionalism in the Age of Black Death. That was the name of the article, if everyone wants to read it. But yeah, please, Danielle, just expand a little bit about this piece.
Yeah, so this piece in particular came to me really, I think, in 2016. It was a year into me being in Portland, about a year out of college. And it was on the occasion of the murder of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling. And again, to reiterate something I mentioned a bit earlier, as being a non-American Black person in America, it really is a kind of unique trauma to experience racism here. And the first time I felt immense grief for somebody that I never met was when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And at the time, I couldn't understand why I was so distraught over somebody that I didn't know. And I think in 2016, it made sense to me. And I remember hearing the news of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling's murders, and feeling everything I felt 2 times over when Trayvon Martin was killed. And I was going through the grief and the sadness at work, and no white person said anything. No white person said anything at all. People I work with and sat next to day in, day out didn't say anything. And it wasn't until a Black coworker mentioned Black people being heavy today that the responses came in. And even within my department, still nothing was said, nothing was acknowledged. And at that time, I was the only Black person, again, somebody who was fresh out of school, fresh off of being an intern in Portland, pretty much by myself, trying to reconcile with the news and the grief that I was feeling, but still hyper aware of the fact that I needed to show up and do my job well and prove myself and present a certain way in the midst of a white corporate environment. And it really shook me up. And I didn't know how to feign professionalism. And so I ended up having to take the day off, a couple days off following. But again, it was just a lesson in the fact that I couldn't, for as distraught as I was, I couldn't display that in a way that felt authentic to what I was actually feeling in the midst of the workplace. And I think, potentially now people I work with would say, white people would say, no, you can totally be yourself. You can totally talk to me. This is a safe space. And even that doesn't make me feel comfortable or okay with wholly displaying my emotions. And I know to some level we can't, none of us can truly do that in the workplace, but it's certainly layered when you're a Black person, when you're a Black woman, when you're the only one, already kind of in a place, or, in the context of corporate America with all those politics in and of themselves there, but to feel grief in the midst of that, you just can't show it.
It's a little bit of an isolating feeling, which is also really interesting now to go from your point of you just can't show it to, I don't think I can find an agency in Portland or really anywhere that doesn't have some sort of statement around, Black Lives Matter on their landing page, right? So it's definitely an interesting feeling, especially once you go 1 or 2 clicks deeper and then you look at what the agency looks like.
Exactly. There's this incongruence with what is being said or what you're being assured and then what is actually being put into practice. And so even though, rhetoric and sentiments may change, at least in language, it's hard as a Black person to feel like you can wholly display who you are when there are other cues that tell you that you can't.
Yeah. You completely nailed it. And it does kind of, I don't want to say suck that you have to make this, and nail it, or this has to be a thing that you nail. But yeah, thank you for that. To move on, I want to talk to Kareem about his landowner piece. I think you and I, we kind of talked a little bit about this being a piece that brought a little bit of brevity to everything. And yeah, I got what you meant. But I saw it and I kind of had to chuckle because I was like, oh, I immediately understand where you're going. And I think we talked a little bit, and you mentioned it too, a little bit about this being somewhat inspired by Jay-Z, and the rappers that kind of like, you know, you and I grew up on, and their idea of success, and what we, you know, then also thought was success, but now like what that looks like for them, and also like our understandings of what success are. So you know, if you could just like kind of like expand a little bit more about it. You're on mute, Kareem.
Guys, I'm never gonna be able to figure that out. When it comes to landowner, this one is pretty. It's just really me speaking from the heart. I just think that I think everything starts with land. Period. I think if you look at every nation, if you look at every country, everything comes from the land. You know, even our cell phones utilize uranium, which comes from the land. So it's really about understanding resources are derived from the land. It's understanding that generational wealth is built upon the land. This nation was built upon land which was stolen from the indigenous. When you look at the Middle East, you know, there's generational wealth just built solely off of oil that is derived from the land. So it's really, it doesn't take long to understand that when you look at any empire, any family, great family fortune, they always have ownership over land, whether that be 10 acres or 1,000 acres or 1,000,000 acres, in which to harvest agriculture or cattle or steel, oil, coal, diamonds, emeralds, salt, copper. Everything comes from the land. So it was just really me just making sure that I just put out something super simple, super digestible, that expressed what I personally deem to be my mission to acquire land and ensure that my offspring and family are able to be always able to build upon that land. And I think that's something to wrap this up. You know, again, it started with Jay-Z, a rapper, but Jay-Z comes from the same neighborhood as me, and to see his thinking from when he first started to his thinking now, so his thinking in his mid-20s to his thinking in his 50s, you know, he has lyrics that tells you he shouldn't have invested in liabilities, and he should have been consistently focused on the accumulation of assets and wealth. And I oftentimes wonder how much more impact, a positive impact, an artist like Jay-Z and many artists would have if it didn't take to their 50s to understand these things. Imagine if they were in their 20s speaking these things into existence instead of 50. I think it would have a phenomenal impact on all of us. And I mean, you know, coulda, woulda, shoulda, but that's me just trying to jumpstart that shift.
Yeah, I think when we had the initial conversation, we both kind of agreed, right? Like, you know, you're absolutely right. But someone like him was in a position of learning himself, right? And that's where it's like, you know, what I feel like this piece is also saying is, you know, you would hope that a next generation, you know, one that comes after us, like their idea, again, like what you're saying of success is something that's completely, you know, different. It's more about, like you said, the assets than it is about just, you know, something cool like a Land Rover.
Exactly.
Yeah. Christine, I know you wanted to talk a little bit more about the t-shirts. And I know nude was probably my favorite piece of yours. But I'd actually like to end on the definitions with you, mostly because like I feel like they're so, what's the best word? I feel like they kind of in an in-your-face way kind of show like this is the introduction to the word black, right? And one thing that you can kind of like thread between the three of your pieces is intentionality, right? Like there is a lot of intention behind removing land from black people, right? It feels really intentional, you know, when you're not allowed to be yourself. But again, with your piece, Christine, around the definitions, like these are intentional. This is, you know, the way the word black, which is of course ascribed to us, you know, it's kind of like in a subconscious way, just immediately defining how you should view black people, or at least like how the world is told to. At least that's how I interpreted it. But please, like, just expand a little bit more about that idea and the pieces that went with it.
Yeah, so I think it goes back to narratives. Henry Louis Gates had this documentary called The Many Rivers Across, and I loved it. And the first lesson when he was talking about slavery, when they first brought African slaves over, they actually freed them at a certain point because they're like, this is inhumane, this is against Christianity. But the way that they, again, the story that they told themselves in order to do this was because their skin is darker, they are not human. And back to the shirts. And I said everything I wanted to do with the shirts, so we're good. But they're beasts. So because they are not like us, because they're not in the image of God, this would be okay to do. So like I put this with these beautiful ebony magazines, almost like as a juxtaposition between the way we present ourselves versus the definitions that we still have. And Terrence, actually, you was the one who posted this about Tinashe Coates. And he posted, I actually have the magazine and I need to read it. And I forgot who exactly he said this, but he talked about how do you still be of good manner, but then also agree with slavery or allow slavery to happen. And it's all about these stories that you tell to yourself. And I remember the conversation that we had about people who might not have known, or white people who was so sheltered in a bubble that they didn't know that racism existed. They didn't know that these definitions of Black were so subconscious in society. But inadvertently, to Danielle and Kareem's pieces, you can have empathy towards that if someone doesn't know, but it is a problem when the systems allow all these people to be in places of power while there are still other systems that say that we're beasts and need to subscribe to them. I don't know if I answered the question. I hope I did.
You did, but I think that there was a lot to unpack there, right? Like there's this idea that while we're also not creating, but just like relearning our own self-identity, right? Like there's also, white people, but also other people who have definitions of us, right? That they may have an understanding of the top layer, say, of like what racism's like, police brutality is wrong, don't say the N-word, attacking someone because of their color of their skin. But that's kind of where the understanding stops. Right. And so I think one of the things that I really took away from this piece was that there is a lot to undo for everyone. Absolutely. Right? Like, because, yeah, you're right. Like, I think that there is a lot of awakening happening right now for a lot of people who just had no clue. Yeah. But it kind of starts with how language and conversation, is introduced to you. Right. You also brought up a point about Toni Morrison's influence on this piece, and I think it was something where she said something to the effect of like to keep the polarities of Black and white going. Mm-hmm. Can you talk about that reference?
Yeah, actually, I have the book like right by me. I love this book. All highlighted and underlined. She's specifically talking about literature, but if you ever seen that quote of Toni Morrison saying, like, white Americans can just say that they're American, but if you're anything else, you have to hyphenate it, like you're African American or you're Hispanic American, because these polarities created this identity of other. And back to kind of what I was saying earlier about when people don't know, but it's problematic when they're in power because you get othered in so many ways. And it's funny that you brought up those two pieces from Danielle and Kareem, because I love those pieces, and even kind of like trying to still be concise, but like do a flow. Like being Black and having to work in corporate America and still carry the weight of another yet unwarranted death, right? But then you're still held up as with the same accountability as your white counterparts, if not harsher, because you might not talk like them, or you might not communicate in the same way, of how white supremacy has evolved from we're not doing this because you're Black and being blatant to, well, you're just not ready, or you're just not this, that othering factor. And it's funny now how so many people are saying like, oops, just found out, but you've held people back from that land ownership. You held people back from equity. You held people back from generational wealth and opportunities just because of this definition of Black, or what we're supposed to be in your mind. So I think that definition of Black, or the intentional definitions of Black, just expands. And that's what Toni Morrison was talking about, just expands on this narrative that white America, who was in power, gave to Black people.
Absolutely. I thank you for just adding a little bit more context to that. Danielle, Kareem, Christine, thank you for the time.
Thank you.
And thank you for the work. Just to see it again, it's just as inspiring and probably even more impactful right now to see it. So thank you again for inviting me to be a part of it, because I was not expecting that. But thank you.
You keep saying that. You're like, I was so surprised. And I'm like, what are you surprised about?
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, on the behalf of the museum and the Contemporary Art Council too, I thank you for this great conversation tonight. I saw that Kristen from Blackfish did in the chat say you can access images from the exhibition on the gallery's website. So if you want to spend some more time with the work, please go there and check it out under the tab for the July 2020 exhibition. So thank you all again so much. Thank you for everyone for coming. There's much work to be done. So we really appreciate the conversation tonight.
Thank you. Is that it? Are we? No. I'm like, is anyone asking a question? Are we leaving? Like, what are we doing?
I'm appreciating all the thanks that are coming in.
Well, Sarah, I know listen, if anyone wants to stick around for one or two questions, maybe we do that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you. So folks want to type it into the chat if they've got a question. Or
shoot, shout out to Teresa Rayford. I can't wait to write you in. Hey.
Yeah.
Or if anyone
God, I'd love to work with you.
Unmute yourself at this point too. I think our numbers are up and down.
But if anyone has a question, just add it to the chat and like say which artist it's for.
Okay, we've got one about the role that design played in communicating the messages of the work.
Yeah, I can speak a little bit to that. I've been thinking about this quite a bit. So a little bit more about my background. I went to art school in Atlanta, Georgia, and I went not knowing anything, not being formally trained in art or design or anything, but eventually turned to advertising because it was the only thing I kind of remotely knew about. Um, and so I started with commercial and advertising art, but then later or further into my time at school, I kind of began to delve more into fine art, particularly artist books. And I recognized that because I sort of learned to communicate in a commercial art context, a lot of my fine art was coming out that way as well. Um, and I don't know if it was on purpose at first, but I think as far as design's role in my work, when we think about its use for advertising and commercial art and branding and selling things, I think the conciseness, to the point, attention grabbing way that you kind of approach that, or that the way that that typically is approached in the vein of selling and mass communication really lends itself, I think, particularly for me, in my art practice, because it really helps me, I guess, crystallize concisely what it is that I want to express. And for somebody like me who just is constantly processing, like I mentioned, for my output to be in this format just helps me to, again, make sense of things. And so that's my answer to that. Hopefully I answered the question. I don't know if Kareem or Christine want to jump in there.
I agree with you.
Oh.
I definitely think that design allows us to just offer a immediate, digestible sort of signifier or symbol of our thoughts.
Agreed. Piggybacking, I know I told the story before, especially to Sarah. This might be the third time you heard it, but when a few people came into the show and saw our work, I heard a few people saying, well, were you inspired by Hank Willis Thomas? Like Hank Willis Thomas, like a few times. And I'm like, well, for sure, indirectly, because he's brilliant. But I think it's more of his like marketing and advertising background, and also working in product, and having that communication aspect. So I went to school for first fine art, and then I went to school for textile design. And with fine art, it was a lot of like expression, internal. This is what I want to say by this color and the stroke. It was very internal. But going to school for design, it was like, well, this is how this communicates. There was certain set of rules visually, like, and making repeat patterns. It's like, don't have a canal because then that looks weird, or this needs to be with this color. And I think how to make a collection was the best thing that I've learned in design school, and make these cohesive things come together to communicate to the audience that these three things go together, or this goes together. So yeah. How does Portland inspire your work now? And should I move to Portland?
Ooh, that's layered there.
I'm gonna let you take that one.
Yeah, you go first, Kareem.
Oh, how does it inspire work now? I mean, I'm having a really good experience. Very fortunate and blessed in Portland. So for me, I think I'm surrounded by brilliance every day. You know, I work at Nike, so I get to be around nothing but intelligent, artistic, creative thought and people and processes. So maybe my me being in Portland's a little bit biased because it is under really great circumstances. But then even beyond that, there's definitely a new perspective in terms of just the landscape. And at least I will say one thing: when you do come across certain people, you kind of do know immediately if that's a relationship you can actually give more weight to and time to. I definitely can say that you're gonna know your tribe pretty fast in a place like Portland. And that's beautiful because it eliminates a lot of the clutter and it allows you to just streamline certain things. So there is, for me personally, there's definitely been a lot of clarity I've been able to arrive at in Portland. I can't speak for some people. Some people I know land in Portland and they go on 2 months later. But again, I said I've been pretty blessed in this move.
I struggled at first. I struggled, but when I got here, I was like, hold up, what in the white? What is this? Like, I was coming from Atlanta, Georgia. I'm from the Caribbean. Nobody told me about the rain. Nobody told me it was so white. But I think now, you know, being in Portland 5 years in, I think what I take and I feel most blessed about is the connections. I think when you're in a place where you're like visibly scarce as Black people, and especially coming from a place where I grew up, I went to a Black school, I saw Black doctors, lawyers, you take that for granted. You really take for granted seeing yourself everywhere. And so when I got here and there was like a dearth of that, I really appreciated my people more. And I say my people because Black people in the diaspora are my people. And it's funny because in Portland, it's like when you see a Black person in the grocery store, it's like you want to run and hug them. And I'm on the East Coast now, actually. And I remember when we were coming into Baltimore, and I saw Black people in the airport, I was like, yo, I just want to run up and hug everybody. And so I think just being in Portland has really caused me to not take our people for granted. And it's also in turn made me very hyper aware, I think, of my Blackness, you know, for better or for worse. And that's really informed my work. That's really made me pay attention to how whiteness works in response to Blackness, how Blackness works without the gaze of whiteness. And I'm thankful for that. It's certainly not always pleasant to experience in a context like Portland. Like those realizations are tough, but I think they've made me just consider a lot more in my work in general. And for that, I'm thankful for. As far as moving to Portland, I don't know. I am not gonna, I don't know. I still can't say like absolutely yes or absolutely no. I mean, that part is tough. That's the tougher part of the question to answer. But that's all I got for that.
Well, I think Danielle and Kareem like hit the nail on the head on the inspiration part. I think it depends what season you are in your life. Like in full transparency, I'm not comfortable. And I forgot who I was talking to. And I was like, I don't understand why I did all this work in New York to build myself up. And then I came to a place in Portland where I felt so invisible so often. And my friend was like, well, for growth. Actually, Kareem, it probably was you. This does sound like a conversation. And so casually, just like growth. And I'm just like, oh, shoot. And you can't, essentially when you're growing, it doesn't always come with comfort. So whether it's forever, I'm not sure. I might want to be comfortable one day. I want to be able to go to my mother's house and, you know, get toilet paper and get a meal as often as I like. But I think for that growth aspect, it's been incredible and a blessing for that, for sure. Yeah.
Sarah, do we want to take one more question or do we end it there?
Yeah, I haven't seen any other questions come in. Does anyone want to jump in with a final question or final thought? Oh, one new message came in. Thank you for your honesty and candidness.
Oh, hey, Kristen.
Shout out to Kristen.
Woo, hey, Kristen.
All right. Well, if there are no further questions from our audience, again, thank you all so much for. Oh, we have recorded the talk. We're gonna review it and we'll let folks know when it's available. So thanks.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
So much that you guys came and for the support, and yeah, it's incredible. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'll be sure to check out more images of the show on the Blackfish Gallery's website. And have a great evening. Stay safe out there.
Absolutely. Have a great evening, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.